Chapter 43. The Sleeping Porch. Ed was always looking for ways to toughen up his younger brothers, whether they needed it or not. In the fall, he suggested to Greg and Gray that they continue sleeping out on the upstairs porch until Christmas. He said it would make men out of them. In many ways, Greg and Gray were already twice the men Ed was, but they took the challenge on one condition. Every weekend, when Ed came home from college, he had to sleep out on the porch with them. By November, Ed was regretting his challenge. One Friday afternoon early in December, Ed set out from Institute, West Virginia, hitchhiking his way home. He had to catch rides along the Kanawha River up through Dunbar and South Charleston, over the bridge and past the state capitol. Then he'd work his way to Marmette, where he'd leave the valley and ride up Short Creek and over the mountain to Racine. Saying goodbye to his lift, he'd still have to hike a mile around the hillside to get to the farmhouse on the hill. Normally, the 45-minute drive would take an hour and a half to hitchhike. Well, this December evening, everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get home. The clouds were turning a dark gray and settling down to snow. A last pale ray of sunlight flickered through the clouds as the early darkness closed in for good. Ed stood on the side of the highway, his backpack on and his thumb out. He'd gotten as far as the turnoff in Marmette, but no one seemed to be heading up Short Creek Holler. At least, no one willing to pick up a hitchhiker. It began to snow, fat flakes drifting down through the darkness and piling up around his boots. Ed stepped into the 7-Eleven store once or twice to warm up and check on the time. It was getting late. At a little after 10, a big Crown Victoria sedan pulled off the road. Ed was so grateful for the ride he didn't notice the official insignia painted on the doors. He pulled the handle and jumped in, just happy to be out of the cold and wet. When he looked over at the driver, his heart skipped a beat. There was one of the biggest policemen Ed had ever seen. He immediately wondered if he'd done something wrong. Was hitchhiking still legal? Was this man going to take him to jail? Ed was relieved when the man offered his hand and began to speak. "Sheriff Johnny Protan," he said, "at your service. It's a cold one, ain't it?" Ed nodded, a little tongue-tied. "Where you headed?" asked the sheriff. "I've been away at college. I'm headed home for the weekend," said Ed. "Where do you live?" asked the sheriff. "Around the hill from Racine, halfway to Blooming Rose." When the cruiser pulled up to the intersection in Racine, Sheriff Johnny Protan signaled to cross the bridge. "Oh," said Ed, "you can let me off here. I'm used to walking." The sheriff looked over at him with a fatherly grin and kept driving. He threaded his way through the town and around the windy road, his windshield wipers knocking snowflakes away. At the bottom of Ed's hill, the sheriff led him out of the car. Ed walked around to the driver's side, shook his hand, and thanked him. When Ed reached the house, he stepped inside and knocked on his parents' door to let them know he was home. They'd waited up and were glad he was okay. He grabbed a sandwich and a glass of milk. Then he headed up the narrow stairs to bed. Slipping out of his jeans and shirt, he pulled open the door to the upstairs sleeping porch. He was met by a blast of cold air. Greg and Gray were fast asleep under every sleeping bag the family owned. On top of the sleeping bags was a light dusting of snow, but the boys were toasty warm under all those blankets. Toasty warm sounded good to Ed. Instead of going off to look for more covers and climbing into a freezing cold bed, he had a brainstorm. Why not just ease in between his two warm little brothers? He gently turned Greg onto his left side and Gray onto his right. As quietly as he could, he eased himself into the deliciously warm crack they'd left behind. Pulling the covers over his head, he said a simple prayer of thanks and started drifting off to sleep. Muttered Greg as he turned back to the warmth. He brought his knees up, and they connected sharply with Ed's thigh. Greg had some of the boniest knees in the family. Said Gray, and rolled to his left. His elbow caught Ed squarely in the Adam's apple. Said Greg again in his sleep, and pull the other knee up. Mumbled Gray, and nearly blinded Ed with the other elbow. Ed spent a long time that night thinking about how warm he was. He surely didn't sleep much. Mostly, he regretted having challenged his brothers to sleep out until Christmas. As far as he was concerned, Christmas couldn't come soon enough.